And I think some of it is just getting used to what it is to begin to legislate and use the authority of different things to call them into being, and and to use that authority to create and to align and to bring things into a reality, which takes time. And it's not a normal thing that Christians learn how to do, and it isn't really that sort of common in everyday life. If you're not in a governmental position, I mean, even in and it really has to be in a government that's where those things happen. Either you're in local government or in some sort of national government. Even if you're sort of in some sort of managerial situation within a company and different things, it's not the same as legislating, because you don't do it that way. In a company, you make decisions and you tell people what to do and you make it happen. Whereas you're creating things with legislation to facilitate things happening, rather than you going out and trying to make them happen. So it is different, and it takes a bit of time to uh, just go with the flow of, when you have a law in your heart, or when you have authority in your heart, whether it be a verdict of a court case or a piece of legislation or a law, then that inspires you. I think it's the key. That inspires you to actually just operate that which you have within your heart. And then after that, it's not that difficult. But we also have to remember that we are preparing things in heaven first before they can manifest on the earth. And some of these things aren't instantaneous. We're creating a momentum of building up what we're doing there, so it will begin to effectively change us first, and then we live ourselves in accordance to the things that we're legislating. And then you can begin to see that expand when people come into agreement around it, and then expand where then you begin to effectively change the atmosphere of an area or a town or city, because you're expanding what you're living in. Unfortunately, most Christians live under the atmosphere, and they live in the same real way that anyone else lives. So it's very difficult for people to discern that much difference between the church and the world, because they're really not operating that much differently.
When you're legislating, say where you are there to change the atmosphere,
Yeah.
one of the problems is that there's principalities and powers existing that have rights, and you're dealing with legislation above, and you're not even worrying so much about them below.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
legislation is actually overwhelming. I don't know what the word is, overwhelming them or superseding them.
Well, it isn't superseding them, but it's taking the position of that which is actually operating above. So principalities and powers and rulers also are subject to things within the realm of the kingdom of God. They're either going to be subject to what we're doing, or they're going to be subject to dragons, giants, other entities that have usurped our authority. So we need to take back the authority where we're seated in heavenly places. And from that place of authority, then the next step is to establish something on earth, completely bypass the atmosphere. Because if you try and deal with the atmosphere without having dealt with what's on earth, in other words, the only way we can do that is our own lives, then you're always going to have an arc of agreement. So people tried to deal with the atmosphere without ever dealing what was above or below. And you can't change the atmosphere of a city unless you change the atmosphere of your life, and then the group of people that are coming together, and then you begin to expand that bit by bit. That means you've got an agreement, an arc between heaven and earth for something to manifest. If you don't deal with two of those three areas, then there's always going to be two of them left to form another arc to circumvent what you're doing. So yeah, when you deal with when you're seated in heavenly authority and you're starting to operate, we are not going to live under this prevailing atmosphere. We have our own atmosphere that we're creating over our own lives, whether it's an open heaven, individually, corporately. Then you can then begin to deal with the atmosphere by engaging the principalities and powers and rulers that God has assigned for that atmosphere, and working and cooperating with them, that they would then begin to take those positions, those thrones that are there. Most spiritual warfare type things is where people have tried to take the atmosphere and empty it or pull these things down or bind them or loose them or whatever, all the different things that people used to do. And even if they were successful, there was nothing that they were able to occupy that space with, because they didn't have any connection to what was truly being there. And most people just thought principalities, powers, and rulers were negative. They're not. They're just thrones. It's what sat on the throne that's the key. Well, we have to begin to administrate with those who should be sat on the throne. So what is the correct territorial spirit? Principality that God has assigned over an area. The angel assigned. Well, we need to work with that angel to take back the principality and power, the throne that's been sat on by something else. Well, the only way we're going to do that, once we've established something in heaven and we've then got something on earth, you then have to deal with the legal rights that they have. So you do need court cases. Why is this principality prevailing over this area, or this throne, or this ruler? Why are they there? What are they doing? Well, they're there because we have in some way have made an agreement or done something to give them a legal right. There could be blood crying out from the ground. There could be covenants made. There could be all sorts of things, that are resulting in the legal right. If you don't deal with the legal right, you still aren't going to have the authority to see them removed. So we then need to cooperate with the angelic realm, get the legal rights, and get those assigned to take those place. Now, I don't believe there's anywhere on earth that that's happened yet.
Like you said something that I think is pretty key there, is that unless, first you have, like, this isn't going to work until you take the atmosphere of your own life, the individual life.
Yeah.
So that's huge. In other words, we're going up there and trying to save the world, our area, but unless what you just said is, and does that tie into what you said about setting captivity free? I remember you said, I went there, I was limited because I had to get rid of the hay and stubble of my own life, and which afterwards I became more effective when I went back in again.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because you don't have any authority in an area that you have not dealt with in your life, and in this instance, a demonic bench of three will function to begin to usurp the authority that we have and to influence the earth. So effectively, you have people on the earth who are influenced by an atmosphere that just empowers the atmosphere. So you get a vicious circle all the time. Now, the only way you can deal with on the earth is to deal with you and me and each other. So if we then start to have a group of people who are living not affected by the atmosphere, who've created an open heaven over their corporate identity, whatever that blueprint is, then you can begin to not be subject to any of those things. And when you do court cases, corporate court cases, if you don't deal with any of the individual things in your own life, then when you come together with a court case, generally you're just dealing with accusations against you. And that's what I've seen all over. People's, yeah, but that's not an accusation corporately. That's your accusation. You've not dealt with this in your own life, so you've got no authority here to come and represent an area or a group or whatever. So we always, whenever we prepare for court cases in a corporate way, we always give people the time, usually a few weeks, to make sure that they're not operating under any of those things that we're going to look to deal with. Because that means when you come to do accusations, all you'll hear is the personal stuff. And you won't, and it will completely overwhelm any corporate dynamic that's in place, because it will be obscured by all the personal things that people have to deal with in their own lives. So deal with that first. And when you come together, then you can begin to hear, this is what is given this legal right in this whole dynamic, this region, this city, this state, nation, whatever level of authority you're operating in. But most people don't deal with their own lives. And they're always wanting something corporate to deal with their own lives rather than dealing with themselves. So you've got to start there. If I'm operating and controlled by something in the atmosphere, then I have no real authority, because I'm what's on earth is not aligned with heaven. It's aligned with the atmosphere.
So does
So
that go back to the gate?
does that go back to?
So that goes right back to your gates that you
Yeah.
have to
Oh
make
yeah.
sure they're
Totally.
completely cleaned out.
Yep. Yeah, it does. Yeah. It goes back to, are we operating under, you know, belief systems, mindsets? Are we influenced by behavioral patterns? Are we still functioning under the control of an atmosphere that we live in? So are we operating under the prevailing atmosphere, or are we operating under heaven's atmosphere?
which
And
which goes right back to our mindset, which I always thought earlier, if I was doing legislation earlier, I would have destroyed the world.
yeah,
Because my mindset was locked into. I was hearing partially God, but then it was going through my mindset and coming back by where I was to start with.
absolutely. And
So
this is why it's so. This is why people are not demonstrating the level of authority that they should be, because God is not. Heaven doesn't recognize it because it looks at what their life is like, and God is not going to allow you to do things which can wreck everything. Now there is a learning curve, and there are things that you have to learn to do, and but you're not going to have the keys to the nuclear button. You know, you just it's not going to be given to you. You know, so when it then comes to legislation and government, it's like we're not seeing. There's various reasons why we're not seeing the full effect of what we're doing. A, because it takes time to establish things in heaven and get that moving, and B, because people are not dealing with their own stuff, and they don't have the authority because they're still operating under that which everyone else is. You know, and it boils down to love. I mean, we need to come back to the perspective of God is love. He wants us to experience and know love. Therefore, we're going to administrate the kingdom out of love, and what we do in all that we do as sons of God will be a demonstration of love. And that's why, if He trusts us to operate in love, He'll give us the authority to create another universe because it'll be created in love. You know, if we don't come out of love, He's not going to allow us to administrate judgment and justice and grace and mercy out of our own mindsets and values and behaviors. You know, which is why, you know, we're not seeing the full result of things, because I think a lot of people are not actually have not really dealt with the things that are in their own lives to a sufficient degree. I don't say you have to be perfect, but God looks at the heart. And if we're on the journey towards a holiness, the way He sees us in terms of being righteous, then He will work with us. I mean, look at David. You know, there was a man after God's own heart, but look what he did. You know, but when he did, it was still a relational process that brought him back into a restored state. And of course, through the grace that's of the cross, then David's sin is covered like everyone else's sin and dealt with, so it's forgiven. You know, so but what did David do? I'm not going to come and try and bring you offerings. I'm not going to try and appease you by man-made systems. I'm going to come with a broken and contrite spirit. So I'm going to come and acknowledge hey, I'm guilty. You know, so but he didn't try and defend himself. He didn't fight it. You know, he didn't do anything with the offerings to cover it. He cast himself onto the mercy of God because he was living out of time. You know, he was living in a relational state with God, which was of the future, not the past. So he didn't function as the others did with burnt offerings and sacrifices. He had an intimacy with God which was beyond that. You know, so we need to have the same. You know, we need a relationship in which we know we're loved, that then we begin to love others, and therefore what we do governmentally is going to be governed by love, not any other way of administrating, ruling, governing, you know, which is a natural way. And if we're going to do it like we're earthly government, then it's never going to work.
And you know what? I think the problem is, though, we chase God's love, and we can't really realize God's love unless we come into identity of who He says we are and who He is.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it's the earth love we're always playing around with, which is nonsense.
Yeah.
And that's why you always go back. You have to bring yourself into alignment which is now, which is who he said we were in eternity.
Yeah.
And who he was or is.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if we don't know who God is, and therefore we don't know who we are, we'll always operate from trying to meet our needs through a substitute, whether it be trading for that or whatever it is. We will be looking for a substitute because we don't know the real. You know, there's so much counterfeit out there that is designed to deceive and draw us into it. And when you have a face-to-face relationship with God in which he reveals himself to you, he will then reveal yourself to you because you see it in the mirror of his face. So we know when you see the love that's in God's eyes, that isn't something you can earn or deserve or earn or work for or do anything for. It is intrinsically as part of his fatherhood and our sonship. We're a child of God who's loved, you know, and there's nothing we can do to stop him loving us, and there's nothing we can do to make him love us anymore, because he loves us as much as he ever could. We just need to experience it and therefore live from it. You know, and when I really started to go deeper into the love of God, it just totally changed how I saw things, how I saw people, how I saw the world, how I saw creation. I'm just connecting to how God feels about it, you know, and that is a much deeper experience than anything that I could manage with my own emotions or my own trying to create something out of my own emotions. I mean, if I don't really love God, I don't have any authority. And if I don't love creation the way God loves creation, I don't have the authority as a son. So I really need to know that I'm loved, irrespective of doing anything. Then everything we do flows out of the love relationship. Most people are still trying to get loved by doing things. They're earning it through works.
So when you mentioned David, even though he had behavioral problems at times, he knew who God was. He knew who he was in God, which allowed God to flow through him.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely.
We're always playing around with our behavioral problems, period.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you really know that you're loved, you won't need to do anything which is behavioral to try and earn something that already belongs to you. Most people's sin issues, the behavior is because that sin is a lack of identity. It's a loss of original identity. Therefore, it's doing everything to try and get back what was lost. And you can't ever do anything to get it back because it's given in relationship with God. You know, as soon as they decided to follow their own path and try and have all this without God, then they ended up in the bushes and covering up and being hidden because of shame and all the things that contributed then to mankind's continued search for a restoration of something which they already had, but doing it in a way which was never going to accomplish it. You know, it can never be, a free gift can never be earned. It has to be received, and you can only receive it in relationship. So love really outworks in rest. You have to come to a place of rest where you just rest in the love. Then everything flows out of that. If you're trying to do something for something, you're never going to get it because it can't be received by earning it.
So part of our problem when we go to the mobile court is we're dealing with our behavioral problems rather than our identity, which gave rise to those to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's okay to deal with it. But if you don't do it in parallel with an intimacy with God, then that becomes a performance-driven thing. I'm going to the courts because if I do this, I'll be more holy, then I'll be more loved, then I'll be more acceptable. And because it all comes from the wrong source. You know, it's like my desire for holiness is not because I'm afraid of God's punishment. You know, I had some conversations with some people recently when we did the intensive recently. You know, some of the issues came up with, well, if there's no consequence for behavior, then what's the point? We might as well do what we like. And I'm like, but why would that be a motivation for you? Do you not love God and therefore desire to do everything in that relationship which will please each other and just, you know, come out of the relationship? Not people pleasing or God pleasing for something, but just because I love him. If you love someone, you want the best, you know, and so So the thing was, okay, so the reason you then don't do things morally that you think are wrong is because you're afraid of the punishment, not because you love God. And that's the works orientation. So it just goes back to the law. You're living under the law because you're afraid if you do this, you're going to be punished. Well, if that's the reason that's keeping you on the straight and narrow, that's going to produce no fruit. It's going to produce nothing of fruitfulness because it's all coming out of works. So it's like, why let's say sin comes through the law and the law is obsolete. So there's no sin in reality to God in that perspective, because law imputes sin and there's no law. So there's no sin to be imputed. So there is no punishment because Jesus has already dealt with it all. And yet, in relationship, when I am flowing with being joined to the Lord in one spirit with him, what's his heart becomes my heart. I don't want to do anything that's going to negatively affect God or my relationship with God or my relationship with other people or my relationship to creation. Why would I want to do anything that creates a problem? Because I'm motivated by love, not by any performance or anything that's orientated by the law or anything which is self, you know. Um, so,
Wouldn't,
that's the part of
wouldn't
the.
it have to be God's love though instead of man's love?
Well, it is because, but we have the capability of loving like we've been loved. Love one another as I've loved you. So it's only when we receive love can we give freely what we've received. And if you're trying to love when you don't know you're loved, then what you're doing is not love at all. It is basically coming out of some either emotions or feelings or sensitive, which is all going to be skewed by the brokenness and hurt that most people carry. And so if you don't know your love, you can't love. You cannot love with the love of God unless you've received the love of God. And when you've received the love of God, it totally changes and transforms you. So then you know that you are accepted and loved, and therefore you can accept and love others, not on the basis of their performance to you or against you, but on the basis of God loves them, and I love those that God loves. So therefore, I've got no choice but to forgive if I've received love, and to love people in return and bless them, even though they might be treating me terribly. How am I going to respond out of my own desire for justice, judgment, and retribution, or out of the best way to deal with any situation is through love, because love will break that down. And actually, if they continue with their behavior, it doesn't have to affect me. So anyone can reject me if they choose to. It won't affect how I feel about myself because God accepts me. Why would anybody else's rejection make any difference when the creator of the universe, who's my dad, accepts me because I'm his child? So people can say whatever they like. They could be as nasty as they like. They can do whatever they like, but it will never affect how I feel about myself.
See,
Because, you know,
I was trying to relate to like people love because God's love is so different. Because like I love my husband, but sometimes we may disagree or get into an argument.
yeah.
But God would not do that because God's a good,
No,
a love.
because
That's what I'm trying
his
to
love is
get
a pure love. He is love.
Yeah.
So love is the essence of who he is, his nature. So the more we become transformed into the image that he's created us, the easier it is to love, because it's our nature, because we're sons of God. Adam's nature was to love. When he chose to walk away from the relationship with God and he lost contact with the relationship with God, he no longer had God's nature. He was made in God's image and likeness, but he lost the relationship that created that nature. I am like God in the degree that I walk with him, and I'm becoming transformed into that image, which is the way he thinks about me, the way he created me, all the things he says about me, which actually, when I believe that, then it doesn't matter what anyone else does. It doesn't matter what the world does, because it won't affect me negatively, because I know that I'm loved. but we really need to know that we know that we know that we're loved. And that is not just it's not a mental agreement. It is actually experiencing it. And the only way you can experience being loved by God is in a love relationship. That takes giving him quality time, him giving us quality time. That means he blesses us, we bless him. It's about it's a relationship which comes out of spending time together in intimacy that unveils and reveals his true nature and our true nature as his child. So then I can love people, which is not based in anything that they've done, positive or negative. Because his love for us is not because we've done anything or not done anything. It's purely because we're his children. I mean, do you love your children because they, send you flowers on Mother's Day, or remember your birthday, or say nice things to you? Or do you love them because you gave birth to them? And no matter what they do, you still love them. You may not be happy with what they do, but you still love them in an unconditional way. And God loves us in an unconditional way because we're his children. And when we begin to accept that and experience it and know it, it will transform all the behaviors which are seeking for love in the wrong place. Because we won't need it from somewhere else. That was the whole point of the 10 Commandments. If you are in this love relationship with me, in this wonderful circle of intimacy, you won't need another God. You won't need to go after other gods, because what other God would ever be able to replace me? You won't need to take from other people because I'm your provider. You won't need any of these things, because if you, in me, all of these things are available in relationship. Now, again, they turned it into a set of rules rather than the relationship it was supposed to unveil. And again, as we know that we're loved by our parent, God, a heavenly parent, then of course we honor our earthly parents who are designed, even if they're not perfectly we honor them, which is like honor your father and mother. Well, why? Because we know that we've been loved by God, and therefore we can honor them even in their weaknesses, because we know the pure Father in God. And therefore, when we look at the weaknesses in our earthly parents, we love them in spite of, because we know the truth. And it's a totally different dynamic when everything flows out of love. And so many people are so broken that they don't know that they're loved. They're searching for love in all the wrong places, which makes them more broken and damaged. And then they search for it even more because they're more broken and damaged, and they end up going down a spiral that leads to total, depravity in a sense, because you end up searching for it in completely the wrong place, because you're looking in the wrong place for it in the first place. And therefore we must be a demonstration of the love of God to the world. If we do not demonstrate what it is to be loved, how will the world know what it is to be loved? Anyone else got anything they want to share?
Yeah, this is kind of a change of topic, but Bethel Church, they had to actually cancel their service last Sunday because of the fires that are going on. So there's so much devastation with that. So many people have been taken out of their homes, and they've lost some lives there as well. And so in the service this week, they were praying that God would send rain so that the fires could be kind of controlled.
Yeah.
So, but that's praying from an earthly plane, right?
Totally. Yeah, that's not using your heavenly authority to command rain or to send angels to change the wind or bring. It is a God help us. And to me, it's a illustration that they're not functioning from heaven. I mean, otherwise they would be administrating this. Now, obviously, people are trying. Some people are trying to do this, but again, you have to have a measure of authority, and maybe God will reveal the lack of authority that they may carry as a result of this. Because everyone's asking the question, well, how can they be operating in such miracles and signs and wonders and this, and they can't even stop some fires? Which is a genuine question, which, and God isn't judging them. This is not God's judgment upon them in any way, shape, or form, because God would not bring a fire to judge them in an earthly sense. Any fire which we have is a spiritual sense, which is the fire of his love and the consuming fire of his love. From this perspective, this is causing destruction. God's love never causes destruction, although it does challenge us sometimes to be deconstructed and to change. So, I mean, I don't know, obviously, what they're doing, what they're not doing behind the scenes. I've no idea. I mean, I get a sense that they don't seem to be operating from a heavenly perspective. Otherwise, they would be not calling for a prayer meeting or praying in that way. God, will you send rain? Because, if I prayed, God, will you send rain? He said, well, why are you asking me? You're just as much authority that I have to create rain. But are there legal rights? Are there things? Let's face it, California had lots of stuff with droughts and no water and now fires. And some of the stuff with water is because they were selling it off at a huge profit and not actually keeping it for their own people. So there was greed behind it. So are there legal rights? Is the enemy saying, the consequences of your behavior is this? Now, I'm not talking about Bethel as a church, but California or their area. What's going on? Is there something that's given the enemy some sort of legal right to do this? Or is it purely a completely natural thing? Things are dry, fires start. It's like not everything has to be attributed to the enemy. It's like, we have very dry weather, and if you set fire to anything or any spark, it's gonna burn. But then the winds are blowing in the direction that create it and stir it. So do they not work with winds of change to change the shift in the winds and to govern and legislate using angelic authority to do it? I don't know, because I'm not privy to what they're doing. You're just saying that in their service that they call for people to pray, but the way you phrased it is that they're asking God to do it by calling out on God and asking for mercy and asking for his mercy and grace in their time of need. And I'm sure God is merciful and graceful, and you don't know the consequence if they weren't praying. But I don't think it's the level of authority that says we're going to stop this, because they may not know that. They may not be operating in the realms of heaven. They may not be seated in heavenly places, operating the court system of heaven. From my limited understanding of what they do in their ministry schools, that's something which is not necessarily encouraged. And there are people who are doing it in their ministry schools, but they're having to do it surreptitiously, if you like, and not in the open. But I don't know the details. So, would I want anyone to suffer anything? No, of course not. And I mean, I've asked, do I have any authority to change it? And no, I don't. So I'm assuming some people are looking to administrate it, but how successful that is or has been, I don't know.
Yeah, they've got the black cloud of smoke over the church now, though, because of fires. They're saying. Yeah. So it's and it was interesting because even reading some of the comments of the church service, like I read it and I'm thinking, this guy doesn't really believe or something, because he's so negative, and he was talking about, it's the fire tunnels and all them calling down God's fire has caused this. I'm thinking,
well, that's just nonsense. Yeah, I mean,
what about
it is, again, that's just a humanistic way of looking at it, or a religious way of looking at it, which is totally nothing to do with it. But some of these things are complicated and complex, and you don't know what is going on, or behind the scenes what has happened, so you don't know. And What I'm saying is, I never believe God brings a judgment on anyone negatively with something like that. But God can still bring good out of it, and that's what you got to legislate for. Bring good out of it, but there's, prayer versus legislation. Well, one is basically immature. God, Dad, will you help? Will you help? Will you help? And the other one is mature. We're going to administrate and legislate for this change, and we're going to deal with this in the heavens, and we're going to deal with it so it changes on the earth. And it sounds that their approach is plead for God to help. And you would think, in their level of maturity in lots of other areas, that would be at work possibly in that area of prayer, but doesn't seem to be from what you're saying is their approach. So maybe they have to learn, to grow in this. And maybe sometimes God does allow things to actually say, hey, we should have been able to deal with this. Why weren't we able to deal with this? And therefore then say, okay, we're going to pursue learning how to do this next time to make sure these things don't happen again. So God can bring good out of it, but God didn't bring it so that he could do that. He will just use the opportunity of actually enabling them perhaps to see maybe that there's a different way, or a more effective way, or a more governmental way of dealing with these things, rather than a sort of pleading for God for help. Um, you're muted, Deborah. Can't hear you.
You were mentioning about the Ten Commandments. God's a loving God, but how come when he brought down the Ten Commandments, the earth opened and the people that were worshiping the calf fell and died, and like, where does that all come in?
Because God didn't bring the Ten Commandments, Moses did.
Yeah, but the earth opened and those people died.
Yeah, because there's a consequence to worshiping another God. You're no longer under the protection of God. Same thing as when they got in the promised land and it was like they followed the gods of the Philistines. It's like, okay, well, if you want to follow those gods, you can't expect me to protect you. Oh no, the Philistines are upon us. Yeah, because you're worshiping their gods. So there's consequences that aren't God doing it, but it allows the destruction to come on people, because the enemy can destroy people if they choose to follow him. And if you choose to follow the DIY path, God can't protect you if you choose to walk outside of his protection. So all of the Old Testament view of God punishing, God causing genocide, it's all written from the Hebrew perspective and idioms of they blamed everything on God because that gave them the excuse. But actually, when you really look at it and you see that what it says, majority of times what it'll say is God removed his hand. God removed himself from that because they chose to walk a different path. And therefore, he allowed them to suffer the consequences of the path they chose, because they chose to do it. Like, give us a king like all the other nations. Well, God was their king. They didn't need another king. But did God say, no, you're not having one? He said, okay, well, if you want one, but here's the consequences. Now he's going to raise taxes. He's going to start calling you. Now you got a king. You're going to be under a different system. And they then didn't like that. Once Saul began to sort of run amok and do his own thing. But God allowed it. So God will allow something if you want it. But it doesn't mean that his desire is that you will have that. But you want it, he will allow you, and there are consequences for doing your own thing and choosing to follow your own path. And those are usually associated with what the enemy can do to rob, kill, and destroy. Because God wants to give abundant life. He's not changed from the old covenant to the new covenant. His desire was to bring abundant life, but they chose to try and get that abundant life through the system of the law. People think God gave them the law. Moses wrote the Ten Commandments. The original sapphire cube, which Moses was given, would have brought a whole heavenly revelation of how to live heaven on earth, but they chose to worship a calf, and therefore the sapphire cube was crushed into dust. And then Moses wrote the Ten Commandments. Because and if you don't believe that, look what it says in John chapter 1. Grace and the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus. And you always have to interpret everything through the New Testament, through the lens of Jesus. And that's what Jesus said. And that was revealed to John, who was intimate with God. And therefore, when he said grace and truth came through Jesus, that was the truth. The law came through Moses, not God. Now, obviously, that is not what most people would teach, because they have this whole system that doesn't understand what happened.
So another way of saying, I think what you said, if I'm not mistaken, if they had wanted or come into alignment with what God wanted or their scroll, who they were, would have come under his shadow in their life and the atmosphere around them. Or another way of saying shadow is have an overlap. Earth within your life and the atmosphere around you, or you come under his protection. Otherwise, it's a fallen world, and it's a consequence of being in a fallen world.
Well, yeah, if you walk the DIY path, you're on your own. You got to work it all out. That was the whole point. Now you can do this apart from God, so you're on your own. Here's your, and God tried to show them that even in the bushes, when they were trying to make fig leaves of coverings, he still gave them a covering to show, look, I still love you, but they chose to walk their own path, So yeah, it's a difficult dynamic when people live under this totally wrong perception of what God's like. And therefore it's so easy for people to read the account of something and attribute that to this harsh God who, wipes out whole nations and stuff, rather than the God who is a God of love. God hasn't changed. He's still the same God of love, but we've made him out to be different. And as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So if you believe God requires appeasement, you'll live your whole life trying to appease him, even though he doesn't.
I have a question.
Yep.
Hi, Mike. Hi, everyone. I was wondering when you were talking about, it's not God who gave law, but Moses wrote that 10 Commandment. Something just came to my mind to ask you. In the book of Revelation, it says we need to come out of Babylon. And I see whole book of Revelation as transition of revelation of Jesus Christ, coming as a king. Well, I see that as we becoming just like him, like as we apply every part of that to personal life. And coming out of Babylon, because we're living in a world where money is being used as an operative system, is there possibility that we need to come out of that system too, or is this? I still thought it was okay to just use the system because we are in it, and he uses everything just what we have right now. Okay. What do you think in terms of kingdom of God operation?
Well, Babylon in Revelation is referring to Israel. So it's referring to the old covenant system, not the system of the world.
So what they were saying is the old covenant is coming out of old covenant, enter into new.
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally. And when you look at Jesus as the coming king, he's already the coming king. He's
right.
He took the king when he sat down next to the Ancient of Days. He already is the king, and we are kings under him because he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords.
Right. In Daniel 7, I noticed not only Jesus became a king, like we read through, as we become mature, we become just like Ancient of Days as well, in terms of ruling and judging. So what happens is, coming out of Babylon, I don't have to relate it in terms of, well, as Daniel is saying, that increase of his kingdom, or as Isaiah said too, it's the increase of his kingdom, there's no end. Like, I don't have to come out of this kind of system, so the increase of his government increases in us.
Well, what you when you look in the Bible, you've got to read what is the context. So the
Right.
context of Revelation was the end of the old covenant system and the judgment of Jerusalem and the final end of the temple and the old wineskin being completely removed. That's the context of it. And therefore, when we now look at what are we called to do, well, obviously not live under the mediatorial system of the old covenant, but that's what most churches operate under. So most institutions operate under the same old covenant system. They just have a different set of laws. These laws are about conformation to a set of values that means you fit into this group, whether it's a denominational group or any other group. So in a sense, when you read Romans 12, do not be conformed to the world. The actual word world is not cosmos. The world is aeon, which means period of time. So in other words, what Paul was saying to them, do not be conformed to this present world system, which was the religious world system that they were looking to come out of. Well, we could say the same today. Let's make sure we're not conformed to any system in our time that's going to bring us under something which is not God's kingdom. So we do have to be aware that there are systems in our time, in our eon, that we should not be following. But we don't need to be afraid of it, or oh no, it's Babylon. It's just we need to be conformed in love to our relationship with God, and be transformed by the renewal of our mind. So we don't put our trust in earthly things. So we're not following a DIY path. We're actually putting our trust in the relationship with God. Seek first the kingdom, and everything else will be added. That's the system that we're in. It's a kingdom governmental system, which we put our trust in God. He's made us righteous. We don't have to earn anything, deserve anything, go back into any sort of form of bondage to any formula of religion, because it's relationship. So we must not be conformed to religion. So that's for us what we've got to be careful about. Jesus warned about the leaven of Herod and the Pharisees. So the religious and the political system. And of course, that's what happened. The religious and political system of Israel and Rome actually looked to essentially persecute the church until God used the political system to destroy the religious system. And then that political system comes to nothing, as God said it would. The four kingdoms of Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome, in the days of that final kingdom, which had two parts, east and west, the feet of clay and the feet of iron, that in the days of that kingdom would arise another kingdom, which has been cut without hands out of a mountain, which will grow to fill the whole earth. And therefore, that kingdom was going to come to nothing as a result of the kingdom of God. And every political system will ultimately come to nothing, because they're all going to have to come to the mount of the house of the Lord and stream to it and say, hey, you've got the answers. And we recognize that none of these DIY earthly humanistic solutions are going to actually solve the problems. So we don't need to be afraid of the government of the world or the US or Canada or wherever anyone lives. It's like, because we live under a higher government, but we do need to honor it in the right way, but not be subject to it in the way of, well, I am putting my trust in the government to look after me. I'm not putting my trust in the government. God may use the governmental system to bless me, but in general, he's actually able to provide for me himself. So it's where we put our trust. We don't put our trust in anything outside of God's kingdom, because you have to seek first the kingdom, then. So if we don't seek first the kingdom, then we're being conformed to another system. So we've got to be careful in whatever age we live, that we're not conformed to the wisdom of that age. but we have a heavenly wisdom that we can engage in rather than seeking for the solution. So, primarily we should not be using the world system, but until you are able to fully function in God's kingdom system, then you have to live where you are. But it doesn't mean that we're not maturing and growing out of that system to live under God's kingdom.
Well, it involves the corporate part of it, right? Because even any of these eons includes political, military, economic, you know, a religious part. But then there's the aspect of even using the monetary system. We should be able to create everything, but it involves the whole corporate humanity here using it. So how do we, well, I guess we can only do it personally and then over the influence, your family and so on. Is that how it works?
Yeah, it does. You live under an open heaven. You live in trust and relationship with God. You begin to function in your own life, and then corporate, you begin to expand that when you come together. And you have to put your trust in God, but you still have to live in the world, even though you're not of it.
Right.
So until we have embassies of heaven on earth that do not require us to connect to the world, then we're still going to have to find a way of working within that system, but not being part of it. It's like, let's say let's say we set up a city of refuge and we had our own crops and we had stuff, but we didn't have all the things we needed. So we're going to barter with those on the outside. Well, you're going to have to use some form of cooperation or engaging until you can learn to create everything yourself. When you're at such a mature level that you can call things out of heaven and create things out of nothing, or out of the spiritual realm that you can't see physically, then you're still going to have to work within the government system that you have, or the monetary system or everything else, until you operate in a way which is not necessary to do that anymore. We're not there at the moment, but what we need to do is to mature to the point where we're not using that system to substitute for God, even though God may use that system to provide. If you're in a job and you're earning money in a job, then are you earning that money and it's all yours, or actually is God enabling you to be blessed in that job so that he's using that job to bless you? And it comes down to attitude. And again, if I'm seeing things independently of God, then I might think, no, I earned all that. It's not I earned it. It's my hours I put in, therefore it's mine. And God didn't have anything to do with it. Well, if you have that attitude, then the next time you lose your job and you're calling out on God for another job, then you may need to change your attitude, because you're saying, well, this is all me. Well, then I better go and find another job, and I better go and do it all myself, because God isn't going to help if I see it as all me, because he wants to show us that actually it's not all us, that he has been working with us to bring blessing into our lives. And when we sought for the right job, he was involved in that process with us. And actually so much was going on in the realms of heaven that we weren't even aware of, to bring us into the place where we see the kingdom of God begin to operate around our lives. So we do need to learn to trust God.
So you see the city of refuge in its full functionality in when the members are matured, is they can absolutely co-create with God in everything, and co-ruling in terms of even in the role of the father. Like, what we say is just as good as what he says, and what we do is just good as if he did it.
Well, yeah, as we grow into sonship,
okay,
there aren't that many people who are operating at that sort of level, but it's a maturing process, and ultimately we have the authority to be co-heirs, so to administrate in co-heirship. Therefore we have joint authority, And
Right.
ultimately, yes, we will become co-creating because we can do everything that Jesus did and greater. So
Right.
Jesus created things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he actually said, well, go and get that money out of that fish's mouth. Well, he created that money in the fish's mouth. You know, it didn't fall out of some fisherman's pocket and end up being swallowed by a fish, which is, you know, I've heard some people say, well, that's how it must have got there. No, he created it. As well as he was able to multiply things that already exist, he also caused something that didn't exist to manifest, like the withered arm, which was withered and actually grew back. So, you know, there's a whole
So
load of
far, I've been successful in calling body parts for people, but I guess I haven't done other parts because. But okay, that's good.
yeah.
Mike, another way what Grace you're saying talking about with Grace, I think it doesn't take us right back to where we started off today. That really cities of refuge are limited by the fact of the degree that we come into the recognizing his identity, who he is, who we are, that he said we were, and that allows us. And once we do that, we've automatically really come into alignment with him. So we're going to be a natural flow that things are going to, we call co-creating, but we're going to flow with him. It's going to be a spontaneous flow. And that's when things are going to happen. But it has to be the individual. It has to be the ecclesia together. All doing that, or it's not going to happen.
Yeah, sure. Because there's power in unity and agreement. And therefore, you know, the heart of it is, you know, when you read the early church, you know, over again in Acts, it says, you know, they were one heart, one mind, and one purpose. That they were united in that purpose, and it says they had all things in common. They didn't see the individual thing. Well, this is my house, and this is my this and my that. And where they had more than one thing, they were selling it so that everyone could benefit. Now, you know, the socialists have they would put a spin on that in terms of this. Well, this is the height of socialism because everyone shared with each other and no one was with which they did. But it wasn't a governmental thing as a earthly system. It was a thing of love. They loved God and they loved each other. Therefore, they saw each other equally, and they didn't see it as, well, I'm better than you, or I've got more than you, or this, that, and the other. It was like, well, we're in this together. Therefore, no one should be in a need. And if I have got a whole lot and someone's got a none, then that is not a straight state of affairs that I would be happy with, because I love these people just like God loves them. And there was no sense there where they were told to do that. It wasn't that the apostles said, right, you need to go out and do all that. There's no record of that. They voluntarily wanted to live in this community that was actually blessing and being blessed and living under that blessing. So yeah, it's a whole perspective that has to come out of love. You know, this is why all of these things it falls back to love as the foundation. Because when you love, you're not going to be selfish. When you love, you're going to look at someone else and value them just as much as you value yourself, because you've got to love each other as you love ourselves and love God. So everything sort of functions out of love, and therefore things will differ. But we think in a normalcy situation as, well, things are just going to be much the same as they are now, but they aren't. If things totally radically shifted, then things wouldn't be the same, and therefore you wouldn't be able to function the same. You know, and if we're looking at living under heaven's government on earth, then we're not going to be subject to the same things that the rest of the world are subject to. And we expand the kingdom, therefore more and more people come into the government of God, and therefore they're going to be blessed and benefiting from living under heaven's. But you know, most people aren't even living under heaven's government themselves. So it's very difficult for even a corporate thing if it isn't a multiplication of what's individual. And therefore we do need to live in sonship ourselves to then come together and be sons of God, because I'm a son of God. And then you're going to start to see creative stuff. You know, when we build a city of refuge here, an embassy of heaven, we're not going to use bricks and mortar. We're going to call and manifest those buildings and those places for people to live out of the spiritual realm, because we're going to call them into being. You know, that we're going to call them like God called them. Like he said, let there be light. We're going to say, well, let there be light as energy formed into the matter of houses. Because that's what we will need to do to demonstrate this is a totally different kingdom government than the world system. You know, because if we just operate the same way as the world, why would anyone want to be coming to us to find out what the answers are? We have to have totally radically different solutions from what the world is offering, and therefore we need to be coming from a totally different perspective, which does require a total change of thinking, which is where we are. I must leave it there because I've got another